Hi, this is Gary Dickelman, and I'd like to introduce Jason Breyer, who um, will introduce the rest of the team that put together this Optimizing Student Learning, Diagnostic Assessment and Achievement of College Skills. I have a particular interest in predictive analytics, so
We'll talk on.
I'll
get.
Yep.
Thank you very much. So I'm Jason Breyer, so I'm the PI on this grant. I want to acknowledge my colleagues. So Heidi Andrade, she's from the University of Albany. And I have Timothy Cleary from Rutgers University, and then working with me at the City University of New York. So I should say my title is an assistant professor and associate director in data science, although my graduate work was in educational psychology with a pretty strong emphasis in statistics and methodology. I have Dr. Louie, she's my project manager now at CUNY, and David Franklin's a research associate, both former students, and now that they graduated, I got to hire them on this new grant. Just a quick overview of what I want to go through. I have questions here you can see at the end, but please, if there are clarifying questions or issues, as I go through, do not hesitate to interrupt. I'd rather address it like when it pops up. I kind of have it chunked in like three major parts. So I want to give an overview of like how we are where we are. Then I'm going to talk about the assessment component in DAX. Do a little demo. It's not going to be a live demo. I'm going to use slide screenshots given the technological limitations here. And I'll talk about some of our research and findings that we have so far. I need to acknowledge, actually just recently went back to figure out exactly how long I've been doing this and searched my email and found the initial emails from 2011, where I used to work at Excelsior College. I don't know if you know, it's an online distance ed college. So I've been doing this online thing for a while. And at that time I was in institutional research, and I was recruited to be on a committee, and the committee was called the Remediation Committee, because we were getting feedback from our faculty that students were underprepared, particularly in writing and for the business programs in mathematics. So the vast majority of our students were transfer students, and so we're like, what do we do about this, right? A lot of them were transferring in their English requirement or the math requirement, but they're getting in these upper level courses and are unprepared because they took those courses 10 plus years ago. Now, thankfully, the committee quickly decided that that was against our mission, wasn't quite appropriate, but it really got me interested. I'm a data person, I'm in institutional research. I want to know more about our students. So I started to explore this, this idea of placement exams and entrance exams and remediation, right? More than a decade later, I think the literature now is pretty clear that remediation, delaying students into credit-bearing activity, does not work. It's costly, it delays graduation, and in a large way, just fast-tracks students to withdraw from the institution, right? So this is kind of the problem we're having. So in 2015, we got a grant through the federal government as part of the First in the World program. This is through the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. So we got about $3 million, and we actually built DAX that I'll show. Sort of built this new intervention and tested it. Then in, I think it was 2019, we got a small grant from the University of Albany to do a pilot there and do some enhancements to our writing assessment. And we have some pilot data I'll show. However, because of the pandemic, that kind of is an interesting story that happens there. And then just last year, we got an IES grant. So now we're doing a full-blown efficacy study where we're going to study the use of DAX at the University of Albany, University of Maryland Global Campus, and Queens College, which is kind of a nice mix, right? So if you're not familiar, UMGC is an online part of the state of Maryland's university system. So all students can do it online. University of Albany is a Title I research university, right? So, and then Queens College is serves a very diverse student population in obviously in New York City area. So we're very pleased with kind of the mix of institutions we have there. So I'll talk about all that. So these are just some headlines. These are the kinds of things I was looking at when I started. Like, well, I want to know, students aren't prepared. What are we going to do about that, right? And we get these, some of these are a little bit dated, but institutions are starting to recognize the problem of placement exams, right? and that they're not effective. And so we're trying to figure out what are we going to do instead. And then here's the big one, right? In California, it is now illegal for the California state system to use SAT and SATs for admissions or scholarship reasons. Okay, and I'm going to show some data in a little bit that kind of explains why I believe that's correct, right? Now, this has become really a big issue in the last year or so, in part because of that lawsuit that disallows it. So I was at American Educational Research Association conference in April, and I essentially spent a whole day on this topic. I started with, there was a symposium with the researchers who worked with the plaintiffs and how they did their research, how they did their meta-analysis to build the case. And then went over to the National Council of Measurement and Education, where all the psychometricians are, and like our industry is in crisis, right, in essence. Interestingly, last summer, so EMIP, which is sort of one of the top journals for educational measurement, Kolchak and et al. Put out this call, right? So this notion of college distance test and social responsibility. If you want, I could send these slides afterwards. So if you link to this, you can get to the article. But in essence, was trying to solicit, responses to, what are we going to do as a industry or as a field of this crisis? And so we actually had a commentary published in there, where we're sort of arguing that this whole notion of testing for placement, testing for admissions should just be redone, right? This should be a learning opportunity, right? And that's kind of goes to our title today, trying to optimize student learning. Right? So again, I'd happily share those articles. This is all in kind of juxtaposition to this notion that students are still coming to us underprepared, many of them. And the estimates all over the place. The National Center of Public Policy and Higher Education argues it's somewhere around 60%. However, it varies often by institution type, right? So obviously, places like Columbia probably don't have a college or a student readiness issue as much as a community college would, right? Of course. And so where we are, could differ. All right. So let's get into what DAX is. To begin, I like to just kind of clearly define some key terms, right? In terms of assessments, I think of them as either high stakes or low stakes, right? I think that's probably pretty self-explanatory. Or we have summative and formative. So I even take something like Praxis and Compass, which were the leading placement exams for a long time, are really summative, right? Because they're trying to assess, students' high school knowledge, right? And then we're going to use it in a high stakes way, because if you don't, pass, you can't take, English 101 or Math 101 or whatever it might be. So what we try to do is do exactly the opposite of what everybody's been doing for decades, right? So our sort of one-line definitions is a suite of technological and social supports to optimize student learning. It is no stakes, and we emphasize that a lot. We put it all over the place, even though we're currently in data collection. We see an email go out from an admissions counselor. It's like, well, this is a placement test. And we're like, no, stop saying that, right? No, right? There's no passing and failing. It's diagnostic. I like to say it aspires to be formative. It's only formative if it's used that way. We certainly design it that way. There's a whole, my colleague Heidi frequently likes to say, like, if you build it, will they come? Like, we built this for students, will they use it? Sometimes, right? So I'll talk about that some more. We want this to be low cost. So in terms of monetary costs, it's nothing. It's all open source. We use OERs. It does cost students some time, right? They have to complete these assessments, and they're going to get immediate feedback on the results. This information can go to coaches, academic advisors, instructors, right, to give them some information about students as they come in. And then lastly, we'll talk about the predictive analytic component, right? If you're in higher ed or you talk to higher ed administrators, we're often asked to do more with less. And this is an opportunity to try to make strategic use of limited resources. So we kind of have a student-centered framework, right? We think of the student as the center of our model, right? And the first thing they do is they're going to take these diagnostic assessments, which is going to result in some feedback and resources. They can use this themselves. They can see where they are in terms of key skills. We use nudges to try to get them to engage in the feedback, right? As I'll show in a little bit, students who use the feedback tend to do better. So they're situated, right, in sort of this larger environment, right? We have academic advisors, and so we have professional development that we developed for them, and we have dashboards that they can leverage to talk to their students. And then in the larger scheme, right, we're talking about institutional success, right? Students who are retained and graduate is good, and we get there through the use of predictive models, so we can identify those students at risk and target them. So let's talk a little bit about the assessments. So of course we assess reading, writing, and mathematics, because I think, generally agree those are fundamental skills to be successful. But where we think we're a little bit innovative is we also assess self-regulated learning, which includes metacognition, motivation, strategies, and self-efficacy. All of our assessments are open source or Creative Commons. The self-regulated learning assessment is actually an assessment we developed ourselves for our purposes. In that development process, we actually started with something like 120 items and did a pilot. What I think is kind of interesting, again, something we did a little bit differently than typical measurement design is we actually gave these items to academic advisors and said, how useful is this item if you knew a student's response, if you're going to mentor or advise them or coach them? And so they had three choices: not useful, somewhat, or very. So when we were doing the factor analysis and looking at items, we didn't just look at eigenvalues or factor loadings, right? We also considered items that, 95+% of advisors said this is a really useful item to know a student's response. We would keep it. So we kind of had this dual purpose. My colleague Angela was the lead author on that paper, and so the psychometrics are published there. In terms of math and reading, we drew items from New York State and Massachusetts, their high school competency exams, because they make them free after they use them. And you'll see what we did is, instead of spending time writing items, we spent time writing feedback for those items. Our writing assessment's also pretty interesting. So we developed our own prompt. We asked students to identify strengths and weaknesses in terms of their self-regulated learning results, and then identify some strategies they're going to use to be successful. This essay is machine scored, so students get some response or feedback within a minute. And the feedback is in terms of key writing skills, but what we really like about it, having read thousands of essays now, is students are generally pretty earnest, pretty valuable information, and it's forcing students to engage in the self-regulatory metacognitive processes that we want them to do. So we have a lot of feedback and resources in the system, and then when they get to a certain part or a certain depth, we link them out to other open educational resources to kind of get more information. We try to build this in a layer, not to overwhelm them. Each time they click a little bit further through, they get a little bit more information. So we have a new, if you're just an instructor, you're interested in self-regulated learning, I use it in my own teaching, even at the graduate level. I have my graduate students do the SRL assessment, and then look at our SRL lab, which is an open educational resource that they could get all sorts of resources, case scenarios, strategies. Writing, we used Excelsier's online writing lab, and then we expanded it to have a reading comprehension. And then mathematics is, we just use, depending on the topic, whatever's available. There's a lot of great OERs in terms of mathematics. Kind of talked about this, so I'm just going to skip through. Is anybody interested in psychometric development here? No?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, okay.
We'll talk about that later.
All right. So I'll get to because you said you're interested in predictive modeling. So I will talk a little bit about this. So for the writing assessment, this is one area where predictive modeling has been really successful for us. So initially we had scored over 1,000 essays. More than half of them were double scored by raters. So this was quite an undertaking in 2016, because we're kind of doing it while we're launching for the first time, trying to get students results as quickly as possible. We're currently using something called Lightside, which was developed out of Carnegie Mellon. It's an open source scoring system. We're in the process of updating it to use BERT which is sort of Google's natural language processing, which is seemingly the sort of the state of the art now in terms of doing that. But regardless, we achieved machine scoring accuracy equal and sometimes better than the humans to humans, which I think is pretty good. We know there's some measurement error there, but we kind of, again, it's one of these areas, there's no stakes to our assessment, so balancing the immediacy of feedback, right, because we know feedback is most useful when it's timely, versus the accuracy. So there's a little bit of trade-off, and I think we might, talking to my writing colleague, we might want to expand this actually in the future, because this also provides a safe way for students to make mistakes in their writing, right, instead of being embarrassed that someone might read this, hey, oh, and then they can go back and redo it, right, and fix it, and I think that's going to be a really kind of helpful thing. And so this is our prompt. I'm going to show, so on all our assessments, this is something else we've done. We have written instructions, we have instructions in video format, and we have them bulleted in the hope that students will look at least one of them to understand what they're doing. But this is here, I could send this later, but this is the full writing prompt. And this is the rubric. Obviously, you cannot see it. I would focus in on the kind of the bolded on the side so you can see what criteria we're assessing. This is all based upon Bob Ugelski's work. He's at the University of Albany, a pretty well-known writing instructor, and so he's got books on this. And so this is based upon decades of research on what freshmen college students need to be successful college writers. So these are the results. So in some areas, right, we get close to 70, actually at 70%. There's some areas where we're having some trouble. It seems like grammar is an area where this kind of approach to predictive modeling is hard. We're looking into other things like technologies, like the way Grammarly works, for instance, might be a more effective approach to do that. Mathematics and reading, we're using a computer adaptive testing framework. So the idea here is we're trying to be efficient with students' time by using this framework. Students get usually roughly 18 items, but they may get as many as 24 if they fall on the boundary of between a low and a high. All right, so this is normally where I'd like to do a demo. I put this link up here because we do have a version of our website that anybody can use. Like I go there, I use it with my students, I invite them to complete it, and as an instructor, I can invite them, and if they accept the link through email, then I can see their results. But I'm going to do it as a screenshot. So my little fine print here. Currently, you can only take the assessments on a computer or tablet in landscape mode. And that's partly a function of the reading comprehension of the assessment, because otherwise the text doesn't wrap correctly and the line numbers don't line. We are in the process of actually making it mobile friendly to take the assessment. Everything else, and once you take it, all the feedback is mobile friendly, right? And we're getting, the reason why we're doing that is, particularly at the University of Albany, where it's 17 and 18-year-olds, some of them don't actually have computers yet, and they're being asked to do it over the summer, which is kind of interesting. So that mobile friendly. Oh, so this is our testing site. You can use it. We're not using the data for anything. So if you're interested, please do it. When you get there, this is what it looks like. This is the home page. You can click the My DAX, or if you're new, just create an account. You come in. So of course, I've already completed the assessments, but if you're a new student, you just have 4 buttons starting. What I like to point out is we don't give students numeric scores, right? The results are in terms of 1, 2, or 3 dots. We use labels like developing, emerging, mastering, right? This is a learning opportunity. This is a growth opportunity. So we're trying to tell students where you are in terms of these important skills. So if I go into the self-regulated learning, so on the left side, we can see our sort of 4 major domains that we're assessing, all sorted. Feedback here on the right-hand side is different depending on where the student falls in terms of 1, 2, or 3 dots. Immediately, each assessment has a short, this one's less than 2-minute video explaining what these results are, how they were going to navigate the site, how they might leverage this information. We have lots of videos throughout. Like here you can see I clicked into metacognition, so we have a short definition. Then we have another little animated video that's, I think, about a minute and a half. It says, well, what is metacognition, right? Many students have probably never heard this term, right? If you go down a little bit further here, we have the so metacognition is actually comprised of 3 different subcomponents. So we can see planning, monitoring, and evaluation. If students go no further than this, we present them now with 2 or 3 strategies. So if the student just looks at these bullets, they can say, well, ask teachers questions about new tasks and materials, right? Help seeking is a big component throughout here, right? So the idea here is we're trying to reveal information slowly, knowing that students aren't going to visit everything, but if they just take a few of these things, hopefully they'll be a little bit more successful. Of course, they can review their responses, because I think these are often really great teachable moments when I work with my students. I often show these in aggregate so that they can kind of see where they are in terms of other students anonymously. And if they want to know more, we have lots of additional information. So we have these big buttons at the bottom where they can, maybe they just want to know more, read more about what metacognition is, or see are lots of little case studies, like here's a fictitious student and how they're dealing with metacognition, or do is just a sense of resources. Those deep link into our self-regulated learning lab. This is our homepage. Again, if you're a teacher, something you may want to use on your own. All right, mathematics, just real quick. Again, of course, we have a video for mathematics. The one thing I wanted to show here is we actually have item level feedback. So if a student gets that correct, they can see their response. And then in this case, it's worked out. So we have both domain and item specific. In our first study, we were working with predominantly adult students, and this was pretty effective, right? They just needed reminders. They kind of probably knew that, and just seeing and reviewing their incorrect items can be a really effective way to kind of get better. And then in terms of writing, similarly, we show things in rubric format. We actually have 2 rubrics. We have a scoring rubric and a feedback rubric. Again, we try to be careful at language, right? We don't. How many people use rubrics for their teaching right? And how do you phrase the rubrics? Like, is it often deficiency, or is it like, well, what's there, or both?
So I definitely find it in the positive, like what you're doing well and how to build on those strengths. So
That's great. That's unusual. So good job.
I'm a social worker. So.
Okay, that's awesome. So our scoring rubric tends to be about deficiencies, right? I mean, the top category, right, mastering is what's well done, and then this is you're missing this, this, and this, and you're missing even more, right? So we have a feedback rubric that students see, which is like, hey, if you added to this, it would be a little bit better, right? That kind of. We take that very seriously. I think it's pretty important. All right, questions about the system? Let me pause there.
The one thing I was wondering about is, being it's all open source, you are doing assessments, although it's not just all numeric or whatever. What about privacy and trust and that sort of thing?
That's a great question. So the way the system was originally built to be we're moving towards a WordPress model. Let me put it that way, right?
A what?
WordPress model,
WordPress.
right? So think about, like, I want to have my own website and my own blog. I can download the software and put it on my own server, and I control it. So initially, that's only a way, right? You go to we put it on GitHub, we install each instance to each institution, we connect to their single sign-on. So it's kind of the same way an institution would implement Blackboard or something else, right? So it's connected to their student information system. So the institution has that data. We have that my.dax, which is just our generic. You're just gonna have to trust us that we're not using your data. And it's pretty much useless. If you look at, I've taken the SRL assessment 100 times. At least half the times I'm just clicking through because I'm doing demos and I'm not actually reading the questions. So privacy, right, so we all handle it. Is that what you're asking then?
Well, yeah, an analogy to this is a system I built some years ago for AT&T, and it had to do with interest inventories. An employee would take an interest inventory, and then they could better match, based on that, what they really are interested in with the skills of the jobs that are available in the company and so forth. And it worked like a charm because we had different valid instruments that we could use for that and all. But HR got a hold of it, or compensation, and all of a sudden it's being used, oh, they don't really have these skills and we're paying them this much. So, it's, that's where the privacy and trust
Okay,
comes in.
yeah.
How do you anonymize that stuff,
That's a great question. So we don't anonymize it. So it gets anonymized before I see it for research purposes. Provider.
Yeah.
But the institution has that data. And this is something I actually worry about quite a lot. So actually, I like this question. It's open source, so we can't stop institutions from downloading this and using it. All we can say is, and we put it all over the place, and I give these talks, it's not a placement exam. It's not a placement exam. It's for diagnostic purposes.
Right.
Using it in any other way, it's not been validated that way. It wasn't built that way. It's not designed to do that. So don't, I just implore them not to do it. And I think that's about all I can do, because I also want it to be free and open source. And that's a trade-off, right? We could, but there's enough of a barrier that I don't think I don't know of any institutions, I should say, that have gone and installed it, implemented it without, consulting with somebody on research.
Yeah, but it's the whole security trust, all of that is really a big deal.
It's a giant issue, and it's a big issue. I had, I was talking to someone who was like, "Oh, this is great!" Thought of students in kind of one of three buckets, right? There are the students who are going to do well no matter what, right? And then there's a lot of students who are just probably not going to do well, right? Which I don't believe, right? I think they just don't have the right supports, right? And then there's students in the middle, right? And so what he wanted is I wanted to identify those students in the middle who with just a little bit of a boost will be successful, and then just leave those behind. And I'm like, no, don't leave them behind. I think it's okay to use this to target interventions or resources or outreach, but I feel like that just feels wrong to me and unethical. But if they do it, they were doing it without this system. This might just supplement, make it more accurate. I don't know. I don't know what to do about it. If anybody has thoughts, this is something that keeps me up at night sometimes.
Right. Well, been keeping people like Berners-Lee, Systematic Web, and all of that.
Yeah, and I can't wait for the keynote on predictive modeling in education. Right. That's I teach in data science, and so I make ethics a key component of what I teach, and I point out these predictive models that Silicon Valley in particular is touting as really successful are not as successful as they think they are. It just depends on what metric you're using to measure, right? Just a quick digression. The example I always like to give is Facebook had a paper, it's a little bit dated now, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, that said we can identify a user's sexual orientation by their likes with 90% accuracy. Sounds great, right? 90% accuracy. Except the Gallup poll that same year said fewer than 5% of the US population identified as anything other than heterosexual. 5% identified as LGBTQ. Here's my predictive model. I predict everybody's heterosexual. I'm correct 95% of the time, 5% better than Facebook's model, right? And so, that's, it's about predicting rare events, and this isn't a statistics talk, but great question. Yeah, we don't. So the trust is in the institutions we're working with the administrators, the advisors, the instructors, the coaches in those institutions, and the trust is through them, right? They build the trust with the student. That's why in the first slide, I'm going to come back to that social supports component, because I really only talked about the technological part. The social supports, I think, are equally important. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, oh yeah, go ahead.
I just had a comment, just around what you said.
Here? Oh.
No, I can't remember which slide, but just how students are able to continue to practice the writing pieces. I think that's so important because I think writing is, but I can talk for days about writing skills in students and being able to practice without the judgmental of okay, I'm going to get a grade. And
yeah.
So I love that. That's a feature.
Right. And as an instructor or somebody who might grade a writing, it's time consuming, it's costly. It means students might not get feedback for a week or longer, depending on the size of my class. So the idea that I can do it in a minute, I know, oh, let me fix that. in a sort of a little bit more of a holistic sense. Of course, we have Grammarly now, which is great, and Microsoft Word had said grammar check for a while, and thank God for spell check for me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a professor because I would have never got through. I remember I got my first, was it, I think, Pentium, no, was it 486 was my first year. Is that where they were? Yeah.
486, Pentium was 5.
5, yeah, no, it was pre-Pentium.
Yeah.
And my undergrad, I worked on Amigas, so that gives you a sense, yeah. So, I know, I shouldn't do that. Go ahead, no, please.
I was just going to say one thing around that, because it teaches students to practice what they're doing. I comment a lot of times, I should not be your editor, right? And so I think having students already in that mode of you have to, it shouldn't just be one draft. You should continue to write until you get to the place where it's submittable.
Yeah, not everyone could do what I did. I married was an editor, what time is now a school librarian. So she edits on Wall, thank God. But that's not a strategy I think that will work widespread. But yeah, the practice is so key. The more you write, the better you're going to be. The more you read, the more you're going to be a better writer, right, et cetera, et cetera. And also, I think, and this is where we're running into some challenges. I would love to get your feedback, right? I believe we should tell students if they demonstrate potential gaps that are preventing them from being successful. But there is we've got some pushback from a small minority who are, don't tell students that, we can't tell them they're bad at this. I think there's ways you could tell a student you're lacking in skills in a way that's helpful. Or the language matters, right? Of course, but to say we know you're not good at, managing your environment, maybe you need to do that, right? But I've had people say, well, how can you say that? We don't know what their environment is, but we know environment is important for learning, right? So I don't know how to handle that pushback. And that's something I was surprised to get pushback from some advisors, right? But that's part of my initial view is so when I was in institutional research, I wanted to know this information so I could help either define interventions, predict student success, figure out what we need to do. And to the ethics question is well, if I'm going to gather this information about students, let me tell them what I know, right? If I'm learning something, why that's their data, right? So that's part of our philosophy here.
It should be used to inform change for the students, especially since students not performing at a level that others. But I totally agree with regard to environment and how environment influences exposure to certain things. That is the difference between a student being culturally successful and one who's, they want to leave behind. But that one who's left behind, environmental influences can impact.
Right.
Where they are and how they move forward.
Yeah.
So I totally agree. We shouldn't just throw them away. We should use that data to inform how we do better enhance our working with that.
Well, it looks a lot like a formal method. I taught mathematics for years at the community college level, and I always got in trouble with my peers because I would use the test as gap analysis, and I allowed the students to take the test as many times as they wanted.
Sure.
I had to give tests, but it was the means to assess the goal. It's the confusion of task and goal.
Yeah.
Right. The goal is for them to learn, right? Not to pass the test back here and say they're bad and all of that sort of thing.
Right.
It looks like we formalize that.
A little bit, we're trying, in terms of early indicators, at some point DAX becomes less useful as they start to engage in coursework. Now but what we're trying to do is create a system where we can get some information about where students are, help them in right now we're helping students in the summer, and eventually as we get into the fall semester, it's pass it off to the instructors, right? And now there's other indicators that are going to be more valuable, like showing up for class, right?
But as he's saying, there are environmental factors around all of that.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this whole idea of relaxing it and not classifying it as bad and all of that is really a good thing.
Yes, thank you. In terms of, in all of our studies, we kind of have two overarching research questions. One is, of course, we're trying to affect student success. And we measure that in a number of ways. Retention is one of the big ones. GPA, when we have it, is another one. Of course, we want to see increased college completion. Of course, we have a 5-year grant where completion is generally measured 6 years after a student enrolls, so we won't actually have that in our study period, but hopefully we can get that. And then the second is like how well can we increase the predictive accuracy? How well can we better identify those students at risk? And so I'm going to break this down into, so we kind of have 3 big studies. So the FIPSI study, we completed in 2020 in terms of the grant, and in 2020. The bulk of the data collection happened in 2016. And so that's kind of why we were developing it. As part of the FIPSI program, we were required to do a randomized control trial. And because of logistics, we were kind of running an RCT while we were still building the intervention, which is not ideal. And so there'll be some limitations, but we learned some really interesting things here. We got a small study through the university to do a pilot there in 2020 during the pandemic. So we learned some more interesting things there where we thought we're going to be at a face-to-face institution that orientation went completely online, and now we're in the midst of data collection for this IES study at those institutions. So we had almost 20,000 students, half in the control group, half in the treatment group. This is just a reminder, the way, because we have to meet What Works Clearinghouse, and so the way What Works Clearinghouse states that you do your comparisons is you're comparing students assigned to treatment and assigned to control. And as we're going to see at Excelsior in particular, we had a lot of students assigned to treatment who just didn't do it because right when the enrollment was dropping, when we were launching, and administrators and provosts panicked and removed the orientation requirement. And so there was no consequence for students not doing orientation, so a lot of students just didn't do orientation. Now, unfortunately, on that comparison, doing a chi-square test, we did not get statistically significant results. And this is a breakdown of all the different components, but I want to get right to the figures. When we start looking here, so here's Excelsior, this is WGU, you can see here, so of course we had students assigned to the control who didn't do orientation. We had students assigned to the treatment who didn't do orientation. I'd like to point out the large difference. This is, I can't remember what this is. This is first term retention. Look at that giant gap, right? So I think, not doing orientation is just, if you want predictive analytics. Students who don't do what they're instructed to do are not going to do well. That means they're not going to do other things. So even though it might be optional, they didn't know it was optional, but students quickly figured out, oh, what are you going to do if I don't do it? Nothing. Okay, so then I won't do it, right? But this is where things get interesting. So we kind of have this post-op, right? So we have students who just go in and took the assessments and moved on. And then because we have trace data, we can kind of see what students are doing in the system, whether or not they actually looked at feedback, whether or not they clicked on the OER links. And so that's what this is. And this turns out to actually be a statistically significant result. It's different. And then we actually did, and we had the same effect at WGU. So we did a post hoc analysis where we used propensity score analysis to adjust for, the differences on. We had a lot of observers. So we had Title I eligibility, financial aid eligibility. I can't remember the name of Pell recipient, right? We had parents' education, social economic status, age. We had a lot of stuff, right? Everything you could imagine that a student information system would have. And so we did that and we adjust, right? And so there is a statistically significant event. It's a small, right? So part of our IES, we're doing a cost effectiveness analysis, so we can look at that. So this intervention is pretty inexpensive in terms of costs to the institution, right? So this is just I took this quote from our paper that's under review right now. So it resulted in, if you take WGU, right, small effect, 158 students were retained for a second term under the treatment that were not. doesn't seem like a lot until you multiply 158 times the $6,600 tuition is over $1 million of additional tuition revenue that the treatment group had over the control group. So cheap intervention, so that, costs, I think, actually I get reimbursed. So it costs me, I think, $30 per month to host a DAX instance for an institution. So there is training time, so there is time for mentors intervention. So that, I don't want to say that's not nothing, but we have evaluators who are trying to estimate the true cost of implementing DAX. And we suspect it will be small. This is really, I think the federal government is moving in this way. Like they just don't want to know effect sizes. They want to know sort of the cost per, increase, because there are some expensive interventions and there's cheap interventions.
Money's a great motivator.
It really is. Yeah, I show that to administrators like, oh, 158 is it, right? And those are 158 students who are now on a path to hopefully complete, right? They came back for a second term. That's, I think, huge. All right, so UAlbany, it was part of orientation. Again, there was, because of COVID, we had to use propensity score. And here I'm looking at GPA. And so here's the propensity score. For those who don't know, this is like the probability of being in the treatment. So the blue line is the treatment group, red line, so you can see it's greater across the whole range. So there is a pretty significant effect here. But here's the one that's more interesting. So if we're just looking at students who did the DAX, so we have GPA and we have SAT. There's a few students who brought in ACT, so those were rescaled to the SAT metric. Correlation between SAT and freshman GPA is 0.158. The correlation between our self-report, SRL assessment, and freshman GPA is 0.162. Both statistically significant, but our correlation is large. And if you look at reading, writing, math, they're also pretty large, right? In terms of cost effectiveness, what is the cost of SAT to students, right? They had to pay, what, $100+ plus test prep, plus, the stress of having to sit through that exam.
Facilities to.
It's a giant industrial complex, right? There's the whole testing complex. Our self-report does just as well, right? So I think what we're trying to argue is I think this is a better approach, right? And more than that, it's been a while since I took the SAT. It was on paper. I don't know when I went to computers, but all I got was like a percentile rank. At the end, I had no idea. What areas did I do well and not well, right? So that's the other thing we're trying to do. Is like, here's where you didn't do well. Review, do it again. Students are generally pretty, I think their perceptions is something we considered. So we asked them on each assessment, 2-question poll, how accurate were the results? So there are some students who not accurate, right? Probably didn't, or just clicked through. But this 77.7 are students who think it's accurate and are likely to want to talk to their advisor or mentor about their results, which we kind of like too, right? Then it becomes that social push. All right, and this is just more on in the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of scroll through these. Your question, predictive analytics.
Yeah.
So at Excelsior College, we were able to increase, so this whole table, I'm just going to summarize it on the right. You can look at this a little bit later. So we had term 1, term 2 success retained at the 2 institutions. So the big numbers you want to look over here are these bold ones. So at Excelsior, right, so the baseline, so the comparison I'm doing is 57% of students were successful or were retained, right? That's in the validation group. If we just use the baseline information we have, the demographics out of SIS, we can increase it, we get to 65.1, which is an 8.1% increase. If we add in the 4 DAX assessments, we get to 10.2, which is a 2.1% increase over just using demographic information. So it's marginal, but significant. So we get anywhere from 2.1 to 6.9. 6.9 when we get to year-to-year retention, right? Which is interesting, like the longer-term outcome looks a little bit better. WGU is a little bit less, we were at 0.8, but they also had a higher baseline, where 68% of students are, well, that's term 1 success, were retained by default. If you want to know more, we have a chapter published in this book on the predictive analytics. It goes both into this and how we use predictive analytics for scoring the essays. Nudges has become an important. I mentioned that just briefly. We're finding this to be a pretty inexpensive way of trying to get students to engage in behaviors we want. This is very based on Richard Thaler's work. Has anybody read Nudge, his book? Yeah, well, I highly recommend it. It's super interesting. So this just shows we actually did a randomized control trial where we were trying to figure out performance versus social comparison. With this population, performance is a little bit better, but not different than social, but both were significantly better than control. This is to try to nudge students to look at their feedback 3 to 4 weeks after they completed the assessments. Really successful in terms of getting students to complete the assessments who didn't do it. And this just came online a few weeks ago in the Journal of Online Learning. So the link's there. It's an open access journal, so you can read that. Last thing I want to really quickly talk about is that social supports, right? So this is our one-line definition, social supports. And advisors, coaches, instructors are really critical. But what we're finding is every institution is a little bit different at how they're going to do this. And in terms of our 3 research sites right now, it's really quite different. So at the University of Albany, where they have a very traditional, students are being onboarded over the summer, orientations over the summer, they meet with their advisors, right? So students are now currently completing it. That information is going to the advisors so they can use it for course planning. They can use it for early advising information. At UMGC, they have a freshman experience course. So DAX is going to be the first or second assignment in that course. So we're going to be working more with instructors of those courses to use DAX. And again, in that case, students get credit for completing it. There's no, it's like you do it or you don't. You get it. And they're going to use that to drive discussions in that week's assignment, right? Particularly related to the self-regulated learning assessments and then leveraging their essay. And then I use it in my own class. I teach statistics at the graduate level, and I have students do the SRL assessment. And then what I do then is download the data, and I use their data from the SRL assessment to teach mean, median, mode, like descriptive stats and visualization. But I'm visualizing that class's data, anonymized, obviously, in aggregate. So it can be very challenging, but those folks are really kind of our advocates to help students get there. And so very, very soon this summer, we'll have a whole website with professional development. So we're developed at U Albany. We did it all synchronously. We were finally able to meet in person, and that was great because what we spend a lot of our time doing is talking through case studies. Here's a student. How would you advise a student given what you know from DAX? And that's really valuable. We're going to put a lot of that online. If you're interested, we'll have a series of videos, introductory, so you can email me or look for it soon. But this is what we've developed for advisors who find this. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please. I'm sorry.
Do you have any initial data on how student outcomes based on who's initiating it, whether it's an advisor versus a coach versus an instructor, if they're engaging in it differently?
That's a great question. We don't have that. We are trying to gather that. So U Albany, for example, uses EAB that's what the advisors live in. So any student interaction anywhere on the campus, whether it's financial aid, advising, tutoring, right? They log those in EAB. And so we've created fields in there so that they can, at minimum, know whether or not they discussed DAX with the student in that session. In terms of who initiated, that would be interesting. I'm gonna hypothesize it's gonna be the advisor most of the time, but I don't know. We're gonna try to get it, but it's hard. That's hard data to get a hold of because there's so many of them, and it's a coding. We can't observe it all, unfortunately, both for ethical and logistical reasons, right? But this is what we developed for them. They love this because we generate these PDFs, every day, and we upload them into EAB. So this information is, to be successful, what we're finding is we need to go to where the advisors are or where the instructors are. So we're going to have a version of this for instructors that will be sort of a summary of their entire class, which gets to that original way back when I said we aspire to be formative, right? I think for myself, in my classes, I look at it in aggregate. I don't often look at an individual student's response, but if I see a lot of students aren't good at, planning, let's talk about planning, right? I also supplement for statistics. I have a math, affect, and anxiety scale, right? And oftentimes, students are pretty anxious about taking a stats course, right? And so I always spend some time at the beginning of the semester talking about that. What's that mean? How can we deal with that? Did you come to me when you're feeling anxious, right? And I have a very project-based course, so I don't have, I have a final exam, but it's, I even do something lately where I give them a data set, a version of Anscombe's quartet. So when they plot the data, they see a dinosaur, and in part to kind of ease them, like, oh, okay, right? And then ask them, is this an appropriate data set to do regression? Of course not, it's a dinosaur. But those kinds of things help. We have another variation of the dashboard that's kind of in an interactive way. So that's kind of where we're at. If this is something you're interested in, of course, the DAX website is sort of our, our marketing page. We're a free open source thing, so we're not really marketers. You said you were in marketing, maybe we can solicit. Mine.dex is where you can use it. I will just want to quickly point out, we have, if you create an account, it's going to ask you, are you a student or instructor? If you want to take the assessment, say you're a student. Because if you do an instructor, you can't take the assessments in an instructor. You can only see results for students. So you can create a class and then invite students. So just as a heads up, SRL is our self-regulated learning OER. And then, of course, everything is on GitHub that you can look at. Here's my email. And to the social media folks, here's my Twitter handle. I don't tweet a lot, but if you can DM me and I will respond to you. But I'm on there all the time. Being a bit of a voyeur, I think.
We do have 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, let's please. I would love to do that.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Has anyone adapted this to the corporate setting?
No,
Because
not that I know of.
My interest in predictive analytics comes from, I was writing blogs for tech companies that were in data science.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I look at this whole thing, how they're doing in marketing, doing first party, third party data, all of that sort of stuff. I look at examples like Zestimates.
Right.
Zillow,
yeah.
A great example of combining first and third party data.
Yeah.
So I say to myself, all right, I was responsible for knowledge in an organization, and what's the return on the investment for that? You don't just and if you look at what our clients, what our customers needed to know in order to optimize our bottom line, right? You can use the predictive analytics to say, okay, if I'm able to have them engage in some sort of self-service activity, so they can determine, so we can narrow it down to some set of skills or whatever that's going to optimize the bottom line and keep us in the learning and performance area within budget, or in my talk I had this teeter-totter thing where you got to increase revenue and business success and manage the costs associated with that. And predictive analytics seems to me to be the right thing to do, and have this self-assessment thing where for me it was in the travel industry, right? And one of the most difficult things is calculating exchanges when somebody is, you got to change part of your trip. Right. It's a very complicated thing.
Yep.
For all of the moving parts. And if you could only increase, let the customers know whether or not through self-assessment they're actually competent to do that. Are they on the low end? Can they do the intermediate stuff? All of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a great framework there.
Yeah, I had never ever thought of it, but I will for sure, and would love to carry that conversation on. I gotta get some thought.
See how. If it's open source.
Yeah.
I could.
Yeah, the software is in Java, it's like Java server stuff.
Yeah.
But the assessments are all JSON, but we have an admin panel. I wish I could get on the website, I could show you like how we administer the assessments. It's easy, but the framework, to me, the framework is like, we landed on 3 levels, right? Because we felt like you can go to 4, it's a lot more work for us, is it much more benefit to a student, right? So 3 seems to be the sweet spot in our view. And so it's just a matter of like, okay, and so we've spent time figuring out what the cut points are, because obviously behind the scenes there are numeric scores, right? And it's essentially we're defining rubrics, right? So if you can think about it like, okay, what do I want to say if they're in this rubric range, and build that out, right? So when we did our initial development, we just had basically giant tables, kind of filling it in, and then the system's now pretty not too bad to kind of put that in. But if you can envision it in that framework, and you can have that assessment that either meets, so we support Likert response, multiple choice, and essay. Of course, the essay written is going to require a little extra because you got to train models to do scoring, but it's not hard.
The taxonomy is pretty straightforward in terms of what they're needing to do. So the kind of questions you're talking about I think are sufficient to do that.
And I think we're only actually scratching the surface on the predictive side. That we're really just using total scores right now. So in those, so I had 2 grad students this past spring. We did an independent study. One of them took our essays and really dove into sentiment analysis. Turns out there's a positive correlation between sentiment and success. Students who write their essay using positive words are more likely, right? So that's kind of interesting on itself. It's probably not surprising, but you throw that in as another indicator, a predictive model, But the other one, they did some topic modeling, and so that's right now what we're looking at. So if for no other reason, the topic modeling, at minimum, we're going to leverage it to identify students who write off topic. So that might actually increase the scores because is it Perlman? I'm trying to think at MIT who frequently, I can't remember, one of the universities in Boston, who is pretty anti-automated scoring. He has a famous paper. It's like, well, a monkey can get a perfect score. It's like, well, yeah, yeah. So we have students who just copy and paste self-regulated learning until they get the 350 words and submit, and might get 2 dots, right? It's like nonsense. So we're trying to, of course, anybody can game any system. But with topic modeling, we can actually identify off topics, right? So that could be another indicator. So there's a lot of little things we're looking at in terms of what's in those essays that we can extract quantitatively to put in. And we have some students who are doing dissertation work who are actually going through and actually coding them in a qualitative approach that may feed, once we understand those patterns on how students respond. But yeah, these are all.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's just,
You got me thinking.
There's and we have a lot of data. I think we're one minute and everybody wants to go to lunch, but I'm happy to answer other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.